Welcome to today's video, in which we take a look at a historic event that had a profound impact on both Ireland and Great Britain, the Irish War of Independence. Let's start at the beginning of Irish history. The earliest traces of human presence on the island of Ireland date back to the 6th millennium BC. Around 2500 BC, the Bronze Age began. The Celts came to Ireland in the Iron Age. Christianity penetrated Ireland in the 5th century, mainly through St. Patrick, and the country became a centre of Christian learning. By the 8th century, Ireland had become a centre of Latin learning and its inhabitants worked as missionaries in England, Scotland and continental Europe. In 795 the Vikings began raiding, establishing settlements and founding cities such as Dublin, Wexford, and Waterford, influencing Irish culture. In the 11th century, the Irish High King Brian Boru defeated and drove all the Vikings out of the country, but the country remained divided into small kingdoms that fought wars with each other. In 1166, King Diarmid mac Murchada of Leinster asked King Henry II of England for help against other houses in Ireland. The latter sent an army led by Richard de Clare, who quickly succeeded militarily and married Diarmid's daughter. After Diarmid's death, Henry II claimed Ireland as a fief for his son John the Landless, and this ushered in the era of English sovereignty and the subsequent influx of immigrants from England and Scotland. In the 16th century, tensions grew between the English and Irish over religious and political differences caused by the emergence of the Church of England. This was followed by restrictions on the rights of the Irish and an attempt to subjugate them. In the 1690s, the Ulster gentry led by Hugh O'Neill rose up against this, but were defeated at Kinsale in 1601, leading to the exile of the Irish gentry and subsequent Anglicization. There was another Ulster rebellion in 1641, followed by the suppression of Oliver Cromwell, which brought harsh treatment and massacres. The Catholic nobility lost estates to the Protestants. Irish Catholics were hit hard in 1689 by the war between the deposed King James II and William III. The Catholic King James II fought against the Protestant William III. Irish nobles supported James, but lost. In 1691, the emigration known as the Flight of the Wild Geese followed. In 1695, Irish Catholics were deprived of political rights and 75% of the population was relegated to a lower status. The result was the 1798 rebellion, harshly suppressed by Britain, which marked the end of Irish autonomy. In 1800, the Irish Parliament was forced to pass an act of annexation to Britain. Thus the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was formed. The national catastrophe was consummated between 1845 and 1851, when, without any concern from the London authorities, the Great Irish Famine killed or drove into exile half the Irish population. This led to the rise of Irish nationalism and a movement of the Irish Republican Brotherhood who resorted to terrorism. During Easter week in 1916, a Republican uprising took place in Ireland. Led by Patrick Pearse and James Connolly, the rebels occupied key positions in Dublin and declared a republic and independence from Britain. The rebellion lasted from 24 to 30 April but was violently suppressed by British forces. The leaders were sentenced to death by court-martial and executed. The years between the Easter Rising of 1916 and the War of Independence were bloody. Thomas Ashe, one of the volunteer leaders imprisoned for his role in the rebellion, died during a hunger strike in 1917. In 1918, 6 civilians died during the riots and over 1,000 were arrested. There were also major attacks over arms for the Irish Volunteers. In July 1918, 2 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary were ambushed by volunteers. This was the first armed attack on the Royal Irish Constabulary since the Easter Rising. In September and October, police patrols in several smaller towns were physically attacked. The attacks brought a British military presence from the summer of 1918, which only briefly quelled the violence. Irish armed volunteers attacked British government property, and killed prominent members of the British administration and stole weapons and funds. Although some Republican leaders preferred conventional war, Michael Collins and the wider leadership of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, opposed these tactics. Others, notably Arthur Griffith, favored a campaign of civil disobedience over armed struggle, and there was therefore dissent on the Irish side. During the early phase of the conflict, roughly from 1919 to mid-1920, the amount of violence was relatively limited. Michael Collins was the driving force behind the independence movement. The Treasury Secretary in the Republican government and also the IRA's intelligence chief were involved in providing funds and weapons to the IRA. Collins' charisma and organizational skills encouraged many people who met him. The IRA Chief of Staff was Richard Mulcahy, who was responsible for the organization and management of the IRA throughout the country. Minor IRA leaders organized guerrilla activity in their areas. For most of the conflict, IRA activity was concentrated in Munster and Dublin. Officially, the IRA had over 100,000 members. Michael Collins estimated that only 15,000 were active during the war. They also had the support of a local non-military organization which provided guns, communications, food and accommodation. The IRA also benefited from extensive help from the general Irish population. Much of the IRA's popularity was due to the overreaction of the British forces to its activities. The British responded by increasing the number of paramilitary police by 2 detachments, but did not want to use the army in larger numbers. These detachments were the Black and Tans, who had 7,000 members, mainly former British soldiers. They were deployed to Ireland in March 1920, but soon gained a reputation as an incompetent force, due to their drunkenness and indiscipline. Amongst other things, they were guilty of burning small towns in response to the activities of the Irish guerrillas. In July 1920, another unit, the Auxiliaries, arrived in Ireland. These were 2,215 former British Army officers. They had as bad a reputation as the Black and Tans but were more active against the IRA. The Restoration of Order in Ireland Act was passed in the British Parliament on August 9, 1920. Martial law was declared on December 10, 1920 in the province of Munster and gradually extended to other areas. The act granted extensive powers to military courts, including the possibility of capital punishment and internment without trial. Government payments to Ireland were stopped. As a result, the violence gradually escalated from the summer of 1920 and was at its highest between November 1920 and July 1921. November 21, 1920 was the day of the dramatic bloodshed in Dublin. In the early hours of the morning, the IRA attempted to murder British intelligence workers in the capital. They shot a total of 19 people, 14 fatally and 5 wounded. In response to this attack, the Auxiliaries stormed Croke Park Stadium in Dublin during a football match and opened fire into the crowd. 14 civilians, including 1 football player, were killed and a further 65 civilians were injured. Later that day, 3 Republican prisoners were killed in Dublin Castle. Officially they were executed for attempting to escape, but nationalists claim they were tortured and executed. This day became known as Bloody Sunday. Just a week after Bloody Sunday in Dublin, IRA forces under Tom Barry ambushed an Auxiliaries patrol in Kilmichael. They killed all 18 members of the patrol. In retaliation, on the night of 11 December 12, 1920, members of the Black and Tans burned down the centre of Cork and then fired on firemen trying to put out the fire. Over the next 8 months until July 1921, over 1,000 people, including civilians, were killed during the conflict. This represents about 70% of the total casualties from the entire War of Independence. During this violence, the Assembly of Ireland formally declared war on Britain. The IRA's only major loss was in Dublin on May 25, 1921. Several hundred IRA members of the Dublin Brigade occupied and burned Custom House, which was the centre of local government in Ireland. It was intended to show that British rule in Ireland was unsustainable. However, in military terms it was a disaster in which 5 IRA men were killed and over 80 were captured. In May 1921 Sinn Féin won 124 of the 128 seats in the Southern Ireland parliamentary elections, but the elected members refused to fill the seats. The Parliament of Southern Ireland was then dissolved under the Irish Government Act 1920. Over the next 2 days the IRA killed 15 police officers. The pro-British government began to gradually want to calm the situation with the IRA. The War of Independence in Ireland ended with an armistice on July 11, 1921. Talks between the IRA and the British government, which had begun the previous year but had broken down due to several disagreements, resumed in the spring of 1921 and resulted in an armistice. This was the result of an understanding that continued conflict would have negative effects on both sides. The armistice was signed on 9th of July and took effect on 11th of July. Most IRA officers saw the ceasefire as only a temporary pause and so continued to recruit and attack the police force. Fighting continued to a lesser extent, although the agreement ended major clashes. The continued resistance of many IRA leaders was one of the main factors in the outbreak of the Irish Civil War, as they refused to accept the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the main points of which included the recognition of the Irish Free State as a separate nation within the British Commonwealth. Let's just quickly summarize the Irish Civil War to keep the video under an hour. The war began on June 28, 1922 and ended on May 24, 1923. The Civil War was fought between two groups of Irish Republicans. The armed forces of the Provisional Government of the Irish Free State supported the Anglo-Irish Treaty, while the Republican opposition saw the treaty as a betrayal. Many of those who fought in the conflict were members of the IRA during the Irish War of Independence. The Civil War was won by the pro-Anglo-Irish Treaty forces, who were heavily armed with weapons provided by the British government. The Irish Civil War probably took more lives than the Irish War of Independence and divided Irish society for generations. And so ended all the struggle for a free and independent Ireland. Today's Ireland is a modern, democratic republic. The country has achieved significant economic growth and stability since its historic conflicts. But hostility between Ireland and the UK still persists because of Northern Ireland, a part of which still belongs to Britain. That will be all on this subject. I hope you are not too bored from such a long journey through Irish history. And that I'll see you again sometime for a further video.